Good day. More than a year and a half after it began, the conflict in Ukraine remains the epicenter of global affairs. This was illustrated again by news that some of the African leaders had a discussion with Putin, specifically on the question of Ukraine. Putin spoke to these African leaders, who was led by the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. He again explained Russian decisions, including the recent decision to pull out of the grain deal. He made it clear once more that Russia is always open to dialogue about the conflict in Ukraine, but that he's skeptical that that is going to happen anytime soon. He specifically referenced the decision by President Zelensky last year to actually prohibit negotiations with Russia in any form. And Putin also addressed some of the African concerns. He explained again the fact that the war for the Russians is an existential issue, and he went through some of the history from the end of the Cold War up to the start of the war, explaining how the war came about. Now, Ramaphosa, in response, said that the African states do most definitely want to see a negotiated end to the war, and Ramaphosa also pointed out that with food prices surging, there are concerns, anxieties that the effect of the war on supply chains should be ended as soon as possible. And he spoke also about the desire of the African states to see the Black Sea once more become a place for open transit of ships. But overall, I got the distinct impression that Ramaphosa and Putin got on fairly well, and that the Africans weren't going to press their points too firmly. They seem, on the contrary, anxious to forge forward with their relationships with Russia. There's also another meeting going to happen to discuss the Ukraine war. This is a meeting to which neither the Russians nor apparently the Ukrainians are invited. It's going to take place in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. It's clearly a follow-up to a recent meeting that took place in Denmark. Once again, some of the Western countries appear to be seeking to contact some of the states of the global south to discuss the situation in Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine, and perhaps to try to persuade global south states to change their position. The meeting in Denmark doesn't appear to have gone especially well, but there has apparently been a decision to set up a follow-up meeting, and that is what the meeting in Jeddah is going to be about. I very much doubt that this diplomatic initiative is going to change anything much, but obviously it makes sense for global south leaders to want to speak to the Western powers. Simply shutting the door and refusing to do so would be unwise, and it might lead to charges that they're siding with Russia, and perhaps to threats to extend sanctions. Anyway, I don't get the sense that the Russians are particularly concerned about these meetings, and with countries like Brazil and India and China also attending this meeting, I'm sure that the Russians are fully briefed about everything that is taking place. So, some lackluster diplomatic initiatives, but overall the war goes on. And there's a recognition of that in the Financial Times. There's an article by Alexander Gabuyev, a Russian dissident writer, I believe. Anyway, he has actually become something of a regular columnist in the Financial Times. He's talking about the fact that the Russians are not particularly concerned by such progress as Ukraine has made over the course of this offensive. I'll come back to that shortly. He said that the Russians seem to be edging towards a further mobilization at some point in the future. There's a long discussion of this by Simplicius the Thinker, and I'm going to give my own views about it shortly. But he said that Putin at least seems to be determined to see this war through to its conclusion, that the Russians are confident that their resources vastly outmatch those of Ukraine, that they can outlast the West, Western support in this conflict, and that eventually they will achieve their objectives there, and that they're in no mood to give up on the war. Now, I have to say that's not quite the tone that Gabuyev adopts in this article. He, of course, still talks about Putin's disastrous choice to start the war and things like that. But if you look behind the hostile tone to Putin and the biases that lurk behind the article, well, that is the essence of what Gabuyev is saying, that ultimately the Russians are confident that they can win. They're confident that they're out-resourcing Ukraine. Gabuyev admits that Ukraine's economy is now completely on life support. It depends entirely on funding from the West. The collapse of the grain deal, the Russian attacks on the Black Sea ports have cut off Ukraine's last source of significant external funding, separate from that which it receives from the West. Its economy is internally, domestically, in a state of, well, essential collapse, with its industrial plants constantly under attack by the Russian military, its heavy industrial plants under attack by the Russian military. Its agricultural system is probably teetering towards collapse as well, and with farmers, or rather I should say farm conglomerates, no longer able to find external markets, there must be a major disincentive in continuing investment in the agricultural economy as well. And whilst I'm on that topic, there's now growing admissions that attempts to try to substitute for the grain deal with export of Ukrainian grain by land, Ukrainian food by land, that this is simply not practical. It's not going to replace the food deal, which has, of course, collapsed. So that's Gabuyev's take. There's also another article by Robert Clark, British academic and writer on strategic matters in the Daily Telegraph. Again, this article needs to be read with a cold and searching eye because, of course, once more, it goes out of its way to declare its pro-Ukrainian position. It seeks to convey a sense of optimism about the conflict. It makes some pretty remarkable claims, comparing, for example, General Sirski, of all people, with no less a person than the Duke of Wellington, the British general who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. I think that is, to put it mildly, a stretch. But anyway, the essential point, the key point that Robert Clark was making is that Ukraine is running out of time. 2 months of the summer have now passed, June and July. Ukraine has not made any significant progress in its offensive. It doesn't have very much more time left. If the Russians are correct, then it has until the end of August. That's the Russian calculation, as we know. If some people in Ukraine are correct, well, September perhaps. They might be able to eke it out till the end of September, keep the offensive going until then. But either way, either 2/3 or half of the time period for the offensive has now passed. And of course, Ukraine has yet to achieve a breakthrough. Now, Robert Clark talks about his optimistic reasons why such a breakthrough might happen. He says that in some places he sees Russian lines weakening and buckling in places. He doesn't address the fundamental problem that this offensive has not even yet addressed or come close to reaching, which is that in no parts of the offensive area has Ukraine actually reached the major fortified positions, the huge trenches, and ditches, and dragon's teeth, and pillboxes, and all of those things constructed by the Russians since the autumn. That in some respects, the hardest part of the offensive, therefore, is still to come. That is a topic, by the way, that I have noticed that the Western media and Western commentary choose to ignore entirely. But anyway, the key point he is making is that Ukraine has only weeks to win, and in an earlier title to his article, one which the Daily Telegraph changed, their latest title is, it's the same article, but they changed the title. The latest title is that Ukraine has weeks to win. The earlier title to the article was actually more pessimistic and more true, which was that in terms of the offensive at least, Ukraine has to take risks. It has to take even more risks than the risks it is taking at the moment, because if Ukraine fails to win, if it fails to break through, then Russia has won. The Russians only need to repel the Ukrainian offensive to succeed, whereas the Ukrainians have to achieve a breakthrough. So when you actually take a step back and consider properly what Robert Clark is saying, and of course you have to some extent, interpret his words or read past them to understand his general meaning. His genuine meaning, what he's actually saying, is that Ukraine is running out of time. And that, of course, is consistent with other commentaries, even that awful article by Richard Kemp, also in the Daily Telegraph, to the effect that Ukraine must kill more Russians, that they're not killing enough Russians in order to win the war. So you can see that there is growing pessimism about the prospect of the offensive, and it's even been articulated in odd ways now by people like Gabuyev and Clark, who still want to give an optimistic spin to what they're writing. Gabuyev, by the way, who I believe he was originally a writer about economics, he also acknowledges the resilience of the Russian economy under sanctions, the fact that Russia's economy is due to grow this year, and that its finances are stable, and that its industrial production is rising, even though he attributes the growth in industrial production, which, by the way, was 6.3% in the second quarter. He attributes the growth to rising production within the military industries. That, as I've discussed in the past, is almost certainly part of the explanation for the steady rise in industrial production. But it is not the greater part of it. And we can see that from the steady improvement in tax revenue to the Russian budget, which almost certainly confirms that the civilian economy continues to make its contribution, and to the fact that there are no visible shortages of goods in Russian stores, and that inflation overall remains subdued. I say that inflation overall remains subdued. It's around 3.5% at the moment. But of course there is an alternative view, and that is one that I saw a couple of days ago in an entirely different article in the Daily Telegraph. This was triggered by the Russian central bank's decision to increase interest rates by 1%. The chair of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, gave an explanation why that was the case. She said that the economy is now growing so rapidly in a situation where there has not yet been a complete replacement of supply chains severed through the sanctions war, that there is a risk that the economy might start to overheat. And so she's taken steps, which, by the way, Putin went out of his way to endorse in a recent government meeting. She took a decision to raise interest rates in order to cool the economy down. Well, this article in the Daily Telegraph took an entirely apocalyptic picture of that event. We're told that, in fact, inflation in Russia is running out of control, even though it is currently at less than half the rate of inflation in Britain, and half the rate of inflation in Germany. But inflation in Russia is out of control. Hyperinflation supposedly looms. And there's even a quotation, or at least a quote from an academic somewhere, who actually tells us that the economy is already in a state of hyperinflation. The Telegraph tells us that this particular academic has a different way of calculating inflation from other people, and that if we follow his methodology, then the true rate of inflation in Russia is 60% year on year. I have to say, when I read this article, it's the kind of article which makes one give up all hope that there will ever be any possible realistic understanding of the actual state of the economy in Russia. Anyway, there we are. So overall, a sort of gloomier picture, no real understanding, no real sense in the West of what to do. They're still clinging on to the belief that perhaps this offensive might succeed, but even people like Robert Clark in the Telegraph and Gabuyev in the Financial Times are quietly acknowledging that time is not on Ukraine's side, and indeed is not on the West's side either any longer in this conflict. The one thing, of course, that they do not do, which George Beebe and Mr. Webb did in that article in Time magazine that I discussed the other day, the one thing they're not prepared to do is to suggest that Ukraine call the entire offensive off and revert to a policy of defense and open negotiations with the Russians, recognizing the territorial and geopolitical realities And this despite the fact that, as that article in the Moscow Times, which I also discussed a couple of days ago, in fact in 2 different programs, suggests, there are already private talks underway between ex-diplomats, US ex-diplomats, and some Russian officials, in which the US appears to be edging towards an acceptance that Ukraine is never going to recover the territories that it lost, and is going to have to make significant concessions, as will the United States, in order to bring this war to an end and to avoid a debacle and avoid that thing which the Americans seem to be most worried about, which is the consolidation of the de facto alliance that now exists between China and Russia. Now, I've discussed that Moscow Times article. I'm not going to rehearse my views. After a deep consideration and thinking about that article very hard, I believe that it is in fact describing real discussions between the Americans and the Russians, which are actually taking place, though both the Russians and the Americans will, of course, officially deny that fact. Anyway, just to get a sense of how bad the situation for the Ukrainians has become, we have an interview, or rather a discussion, that Putin has just had in St. Petersburg with Russian correspondents. Now, the Kremlin has not yet provided a complete transcript of this, if you like, impromptu press conference. They've only provided an excerpt which addresses a widespread concern that existed towards the end of the Soviet period within the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union had made huge investments in Africa. There were certain people of a, I should say, generally liberal, pro-Western view who were arguing at that time that those investments had been for nothing. Africa had provided no value in return. Putin takes that on head on. He said that what the Soviet Union achieved through its heavy investment in Africa was that it created a huge store, a huge fund of goodwill in Africa, with Africa today in pole position to become a major economic center of the future, with Africa looking like it's working towards overcoming the problems that it has experienced in the past, which have held it back. That fund of goodwill is something that the Russians should be attracted to building upon, and it is absolutely, therefore, in Russia's interests to forge links, close links with Africa, both today and even more so in the future. So that was the one section of this press conference that the Kremlin has so far published. It will probably publish the rest later. But in the meantime, we have excerpts from the official Russian news agency TASS, and we read about the ongoing Ukrainian offensive. The Ukrainian military did not succeed in any of the areas where it tried to advance. Everywhere the enemy was stopped, pushed back. This is from Putin. The Ukrainian armed forces withdrew their assault units to places where they are restoring combat capability due to heavy losses. These are summaries of Putin's words. They have also changed tactics to reduce equipment losses. We then have what he said, what is a direct quote, personnel, that is to say infantry, are brought up, thrown out. In other words, they leave their armoured personnel carriers. Equipment disappears immediately. In other words, they ask armoured personnel carriers pull back, and the infantry attack on foot. And this leads to heavy losses in personnel. That's what Putin said. And then he gives us some idea of the scale of Ukrainian losses up to this point. He said that since the beginning of the so-called counteroffensive, Kiev has lost 415 tanks and more than 1,300 armoured vehicles of various classes. Putin went on to say that in the area of responsibility of the battle group Center, that's the group commanded by General Mobilisation, the Russian military not only repels the enemy's attacks, but also goes on a counteroffensive. They've advanced in two areas, in one area 15 kilometers along the front and about 4 kilometers in depth. And in fact, over the last few hours, there have been reports of further Russian advances in this area. He's talking about the Kupiansk, Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman area. We now see multiple advances in this area. There's more reports now of more villages either being approached by the Russians or captured by the Russians over the course of this fighting. And this looks like a broad front offensive with the Russians pushing towards Kupiansk and towards other places like Liman and, of course, to the Oskol River. And then Putin gives an explanation of his own role in the war. And he says, I do not consider it my business to manage the troops. It is wrong and even harmful. But of course, I'm aware of what is going on there. Several times a day, I contact the leadership of the Defense Ministry. If necessary, talk to specific units. So he says he doesn't command the troops. He doesn't give orders. He doesn't make plans and expect the military to adopt them. He's left all of that to the military leaders themselves, to people like General Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff, who is the overall commander, to the other military commanders, who, in my opinion, almost certainly still include General Surovikin, to other senior military officers operating in charge of troops on the front lines. And Putin's job, as I said, is he gets advice, but he makes the political decisions. He does not get involved directly, as we know Zelensky does, in the actual battlefield decisions. He recognizes his own limitations as a civilian and doesn't try to micromanage the war in that way. He does, however, from time to time, contact specific units. He speaks to commanders. He makes them aware that he is there, taking an interest in what they do. No doubt he congratulates them when they've achieved some success, either in offensive war or in defense. He probably also is there in case somebody needs to speak to the president of the country to express views about the political situation. Anyway, he engages in that kind of thing, what I would call ultimately morale-building exercises. Now, he has quite a lot to say about his relations with President Erdogan of Turkey. He talked about the transfer of the Azov commanders by Turkey back to Ukraine. He said that there was an agreements between Moscow and Ankara about this, but he's not prepared to comment further. He's clearly still furious about this particular incident, Erdogan's decision to send these commanders back to Ukraine. But Putin went out of his way to make it clear that the transfer of the Azov fighters to Ukraine by Erdogan, with Erdogan's permission, that did not play any role at all in Russia's decision to pull out of the grain deal. One thing has nothing to do with the other, as he put it. And on a potential meeting with Erdogan, he said that yes, a meeting will take place. It's not yet been decided whether he will go to Turkey or whether Erdogan will come to Russia. Either he will come to us or I will visit him. We will see. And he, on the topic of his non-attendance at the BRICS summit in South Africa, he said only simply that I don't think that my stay at the BRICS summit is more important than my stay in Russia now. In other words, he is involved managing a war. He has to be there on regular call, on constant call, traveling to South Africa or other places might not be appropriate or convenient at this particular time. Of course, it's more complicated than that. As we know, the warrant from the ICC is still floating around. South Africa has got itself into a legal difficulties over this. So undoubtedly that did play a role. But anyway, Putin has also said that he hasn't yet made a decision about whether he's going to attend the G20 summit in India. And he says, don't know yet. I haven't thought about it. I haven't decided. We'll see. So we'll see what he does. I'm pretty sure that he will go to the G20 summit in India, if only to annoy the Western powers, who will probably have to go to elaborate lengths to steer clear of him, as they did at previous G20 meetings. Anyway, he also discussed the the recent attack on the Crimean Bridge. He said that the Russian military carried out a series of preventive strikes on the places where the underwater drones, the seaborne drones rather, not underwater, that were sent from and where they were manufactured. And this, of course, is part of the explanation for the attack on the Black Sea ports, Ukraine's Black Sea ports, where undoubtedly preventing Ukraine exporting grain is also plays a role in this. And then he also says that there have been proposals to improve the security of the bridge. This is technical, physical protection, the use of other technical means. It is not very expensive, but I hope it will be reliable. Well, we'll see what that amounts to. And then he talked about other things like the seizure of properties of Western companies in Russia. He made it clear that what has happened was only a temporary measure relating to a few companies, and he says that this is not going to be extended or expanded, and that where it was done, it was due to the fact that the management of these companies tried to put pressure on Russian citizens, their employees, intimidating them with possible dismissals in case they showed a certain civic position. I hope that this will not be repeated in the future. So anyway, that was Putin's interview. But again, you can see from this that he's clearly not intimidated by the progress of the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive. He thinks overall that the situation is shaping out to Russia's advantage. He talks about the very heavy Ukrainian losses, 415 tanks knocked out. Of course, not all of them are permanently lost to Ukraine. Ukraine perhaps can retrieve some of them and repair them and bring them back into the battle. But as I discussed in a recent program, the Russians seem increasingly to be acting to send Lancet kamikaze drones to destroy completely knocked out tanks that litter the battlefields, putting those tanks out of Ukraine's reach once and for all, so that they can't be repaired. And anyway, he talks about those losses in tanks, 415 tanks knocked out, 1,300 armoured vehicles of various descriptions knocked out as well. And overall, my impression of this interview was that he came across as pretty confident, though I should say again, just to reiterate, I haven't seen a full transcript of this. It's not an interview of these responses to the journalists. I'll have to wait for the Kremlin to provide a complete transcript, and then I might return to this topic again, but only if something new is revealed. So, what has in the meantime been happening on the battlefronts, and are we seeing anything happen which might lead us to think that the hopes of those people in the West, that the situation might be turned round? Anyway, are we seeing anything to that effect? Well, I would say the answer is no. There was a lot of confusion yesterday about the precise situation in the village of Staromayorsk, in the Vremevka Ledge area. There were reports that were coming through all of yesterday that the Russians have launched a counterattack and had recaptured part or even perhaps all of Staromayorsk, knocked the Ukrainians out of the village. There were suggestions that the Ukrainians had suffered very heavy losses, and it was all very unclear exactly what was going on. But anyway, there were reports to that effect, even though there was also an admission that a paratroop regiment, which from what I can understand is not a part of the regular Russian army, but which belongs to the Donbass militia, had actually been pulled out of this particular area because it needed to be reconstituted. In other words, it has suffered losses, and it's been fighting in this particular area for a very long time. But there were attacks by armoured units and by other units, and that they'd been steadily clearing and retaking Staromayorsk. Well, that was yesterday. Today, there's a report by Alexander Khodorkovsky, one of the leading commanders of the Donbass militia, commander of the Vostok regiment, one of the best regiments in the Donbass army. He writes as if the Russians do not occupy Staromayorsk, and as if Staromayorsk remains effectively under Ukrainian control. But he goes on to say that whatever gains Ukraine has achieved by capturing Staromayorsk are not important. The place is not of any great strategic significance. The Ukrainians are throwing away large numbers of men in order to capture and hold this village. And he said that, in fact, the Ukrainians are trying or planning to attack another village close to Staromayorsk, and that they're so keen to do that, and they're in such a hurry to do that, that they've not even established proper fortifications in Staromayorsk to try to consolidate their control of this particular village. So that's what Khodorkovsky said. He basically suggested that this was more of a diversionary exercise. He said that it wasn't of any particular military significance, but he seemed to be contradicting yesterday's claims that the Russians had re-entered the village, pushed the Ukrainians out, perhaps even recaptured it. I'm going to suggest that what is actually happening is that there is very fluid fighting in this area, and that the Russians are adopting, precisely in this area, the same strategy that I discussed yesterday, which they followed in the Piatikhatki area, much further to the west, at the other end of the front lines. And that is that they have essentially leveled the village so that there's no cover there. That means that the Ukrainians aren't able to hold the village, because if they try to enter the village and to position troops there, then they are exposed to relentless shelling by the Russian artillery. And that essentially means that further advances beyond this village by Ukraine, by the Ukrainian military, has become more difficult, though obviously not completely impossible. And this is consistent with what I've heard about the topography of the Vremevka ledge. We're talking about a narrow, winding country road along which all this fighting is taking place. There's a report, I think I read it on Slavyangrad, that the road on either side has been very heavily mined by the Russians, so that the Ukrainians are in effect limited to this road. That means that every village along the road becomes a kind of block. It also means that from a Russian point of view, now that they're perhaps somewhat closer to their fortified lines where their heavy artillery is based, and can control a village, the village, with that artillery better from higher positions and from fortified positions, that gives them a good, they've now reached a point where perhaps they feel that they can leave the village in question in the grey zone, allow the Ukrainians to try to advance through it from time to time, but pound them with artillery whenever they do. And Khodorkovsky's suggestion that the Ukrainians are in a hurry to try to capture the next village beyond Staromayorsk might be a sign that the Ukrainians themselves understand this and are in a hurry to move forward beyond Staromayorsk before Staromayorsk is converted by the Russians into the next Pyatikhatki. Anyway, that is my somewhat speculative discussion of the events around this particular village. Like Khodorkovsky, I don't think this battle for Staromayorsk has any great overarching significance. As I've discussed many times, it's absolutely clear to me that Ukraine assumed that they would be able to clear the Russians out of the Vremevka ledge on the very first day of their offensive, on the 4th of June. That was where one of the big armoured punches initially happened. They failed in that. They suffered very heavy losses. And the fact that they're still trying to push beyond the Vremevka ledge and have not yet succeeded in doing so, and have not yet reached those heavy fortified Russian lines that lie beyond it. After 2 months of intense fighting and very heavy losses, it shows both the extent of their failure and also, even more perhaps, the colossal challenge that lies ahead of them. So that's what I wanted to say about the fighting in Staromayorsk. There's more reports also about fighting in Kleshcheyevka. Difficult to tell exactly what's going on there. From what I can gather, after a Russian counterattack, which pushed Ukrainian troops out of Kleshcheyevka, the Ukrainians have again attempted to push the Russians back, but it's difficult to get much of an overall picture. This is, of course, happening in the Bakhmut area, as I should say. Now, on the southern front lines, yesterday was quiet, largely, as I said, because of the rains that have taken place there. It seems that there's been heavy rains in Zaporozhye and Kherson region and in southern Donbass. And both armies have taken advantage, if that's the right word, of these heavy rains to stop and consolidate, and there was no news yesterday of any major or serious attacks. Though, of course, fighting does take place, attacks do happen. They happen every day, probably every hour. And if you go to the daily bulletin of the Ministry of Defense, of the Russian Ministry of Defense, they will provide an overall picture of the scale of the losses that are happening. Anyway, my impression, coming back to what Gabuyev was saying about the Ukrainians making incremental progress, is that I don't, for the moment, see any progress at all. I suspect that Gabuyev and others in the West, Robert Clark and people like him, are perhaps placing too much weight on comments made by certain Ukrainian officials, which are clearly intended to lift sagging morale on the Ukrainian side. So we've heard comments from Kirill Budanov, the returned chief of the Ukrainian military intelligence. He disappeared for a time after the headquarters of Ukrainian military intelligence was attacked by the Russians, and there was speculation for a time that he'd been severely injured or even killed, but he is in fact alive, as from what I can see, well, and is out there discussing things and talking about what's going on. Anyway, Budanov has again said that he expects Ukraine to be reaching Crimea soon, though this time he hasn't given a date. He has given dates, by the way, in the past, and all of those dates are already in the past. So I don't think one should put too much credence on this. And Arestovich, Zelensky's former media chief, a person who was pushed out in very murky circumstances in the winter, and he made some very critical comments both about the general situation in Ukraine and about the progress of the war, but who seems recently to be trying to rehabilitate himself. Anyway, Arestovich is talking about Ukraine recapturing Crimea in October. As I said, I don't think we should take these claims as having any real substance to them. In the case of Arestovich, I doubt that he's privy any longer to any military situation. But the slow progress of the offensive, the very heavy Ukrainian losses, all of this must be causing morale to sag in Ukraine, including, I suspect, amongst the soldiers. Remember that cynical comment made by a Ukrainian soldier, Sergei, interviewed by the London Times, discussing the fight in Staromayorsk. Sergei saying it took Ukraine a week to capture this village. There's 12 more before Ukraine reaches Mariupol. So you are already getting some sense of the cynicism and the falling morale. So Ukrainian commanders must be aware of that, and that explains these comments that Budanov and Arestovich are now making. Anyway, so that's the situation on the front lines. There were other things that went on. Now, there were two Ukrainian attacks which have happened over the last few hours. One which has attracted a lot of attention. The other which I think is in some respects much more consequential, which has attracted almost no attention at all. The first one, I should say both of these attacks were failures. The first one was another Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow. And Ukrainian drones moved towards Moscow. Apparently, debris from one of these drones fell on some buildings in Moscow's business center. Doesn't seem as if anybody was killed, and all of the drones apparently were brought down in one form or another by the Russian air defenses. Ukraine has been continuing with these pinprick attacks with these drones, and they continue to get disproportionate amount of attention in the Western media and in the Ukrainian media, even though in reality they are becoming less effective. The Russian air defenses, Moscow's air defenses, which seem to be relying, incidentally, increasingly on electronic jamming systems, are gradually snuffing out this, choking off this drone threat. Recall that just a few months ago, 2 Ukrainian drones actually reached the Kremlin itself and did superficial damage to the dome of the Senate building in the Kremlin, where the building where Putin's office is located, with the Russians suggesting that that attack was part of an assassination attack on Putin himself. These latest drone attacks by what appear to be very small drones, they need to be small in order to avoid detection by Russian radar, though it seems even that is increasingly failing to happen anymore. Anyway, these attacks by these small drones, which can only be considered pinprick attacks, they're not doing any actual damage to the city, they're not interfering with the life of the city in any way. My colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, who I work with on the Duran and who has his own channel alongside mine. He has, as those of you who follow your channel, as his channel, as perhaps you all should. Anyway, he has recently been in Moscow, where he's provided me with a very interesting account of the city. We're probably going to do a program discussing his impressions of the life of the city. The one thing that he did say, and he was actually in Moscow whilst one of these drone attacks was underway, which is that the life of the city went on, people barely noticed. So these are pinprick attacks. They are not having any significant effect on the life of Moscow, and they're not having any effect at all on the Russian war effort. However, despite these attacks being pinpricks, despite them becoming increasingly less effective, what we see is a huge amount of publicity about them. A lot of the media publications in the West are reporting them. And they are not reporting what happened, or what the Russians claim happened, in an entirely different attack. And that is that Ukraine attempted to launch, according to the Russians, and we only have the Russians' account of this, a major missile strike on Crimea. And allegedly 12 British Storm Shadow missiles were used in this attack. Now, that would make it, if this is true, the biggest attack with Storm Shadow missiles that Ukraine has launched up to this point. Now, there have been other attacks with Storm Shadow missiles upon Crimea, and some of them have got through. There were successful attacks by Ukraine, as I remember, on a training base, on an ammunition dump. There were instances where Storm Shadows, under cover of a drone attack, were able to penetrate the Russian defences and were able to hit their targets. And as I recall, there was one attack where 2 Storm Shadows were launched and both of them got through, according to the Russians. And I seem to recall that there was another attack when 4 Storm Shadows were used and all 4 of them got through. Well, on this occasion, the Russians claim that this was an attack by 12 Storm Shadow missiles, which would make it a very, very big attack indeed. But the Russians also say that all 12 of these Storm Shadow missiles were shot down. Now, if that is correct, then it would suggest that the Russians have finally mastered the technique of intercepting and shooting down Storm Shadow missiles. They have had some success in shooting down some Storm Shadow missiles in the past, but shooting down a volley of 12 of them over the space of a single day does seem remarkable. Now, it could be that the Russians are making all this up, though I have to say my impression generally is that when the Russians report interceptions, they generally are reasonably accurate about what they're reporting, though sometimes undoubtedly they get things wrong. They don't report things correctly, either because they're lying, which of course they might be doing, or because they're making a mistake. If this report is correct, then it is a major blow for Ukraine and for the Western powers, because clearly a great deal of hope has been invested in the Storm Shadow missile, and if the Russians are now able to shoot them down a dozen at a time, then that hope, it's clear, has been misplaced. Now, we do know that one Storm Shadow missile, which the Russians did bring down, was largely intact. And we also know that it was shipped off in a hurry to a laboratory in Moscow, where it was studied by Russian technicians. And it could be, perhaps, that the Russian air defenses have been briefed on the results of this study, and that has helped them perfect their work of shooting these missiles down. I would simply say, though, that if that is the case, then the turnaround has been remarkably fast. There were only a few, as I recall, it was only about 2 or 3 weeks ago, or perhaps even less than that there were reports about the Storm Shadow missile, and pictures of it, by the way, which had been brought down, and about how it was going to be sent to Moscow for examination. If the Russians, in just that short time, have understood the system's secrets and have communicated them to their air defense troops, and their air defense troops have successfully incorporated that information to the point where they can shoot down 12 missiles in one volley, then that speaks of extraordinary levels of efficiency. But having said that, this is wartime, and maybe given that that is so, and the priority that would be accorded to this kind of work, maybe that's not so surprising. But anyway, I do register the fact, I think we should all register the fact, that the Russians are claiming that they shot down 12 Storm Shadow missiles in a go, with all that potentially means. Now, whilst I am talking about Western weapon systems which have fallen into Russian hands and have been sent to Moscow for examination, or perhaps not just Moscow, to all the various laboratories up and down Russia for examination, we do have confirmed evidence that the Russians have captured one more Western system, and this is indisputably the case because we see again Russian soldiers milling around the vehicle which they captured, which is one of these advanced Swedish infantry fighting vehicles, of which Sweden has supplied 50 to Ukraine. Now, there are some people who say that these Swedish infantry fighting vehicles are the best infantry fighting vehicles in the world. They have a very powerful cannon, 40mm, more powerful than the 25mm cannon operated by the Bradley, or the 30mm cannons operated by most, though not all, Russian infantry fighting vehicles, said to be well armoured, highly manoeuvrable, and all those things. Well, I'm not going to try and assess whose infantry fighting vehicles are the best, but the fact remains that the Russians have now captured one intact, and no doubt it will be heading east, perhaps not to Moscow in this case, but maybe to Kurgan, where there's the big laboratories and factories where the Russians develop and design their own infantry fighting vehicles, and maybe they'll be looking over this vehicle there and reaching views both as to its vulnerabilities and as to any lessons they can learn from it. And we now have lots of evidence that the Russians have intact Caesar howitzers, Leopard 2 tanks. Undoubtedly, they possess an AMX-10 RC wheeled tank, and they also have an intact Bradley, at least one. And all of these, as I said, have been poured over by the Russians, and they no doubt forming their own views about these systems. I should say that Putin, in that press conference that I discussed previously, apparently also said, though it's not in the TASS report, that 2/3 of the armoured vehicles that the Russians have destroyed over the course of this offensive are Western sourced. Now, it could be that this graveyard of Western armoured vehicles, which is what Ukraine is becoming, is another reason why apparently the United States has decided to reverse the earlier decisions about supplies of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Now, I suspect that this remains a contested issue, and it could very well be that it will be reversed again shortly. But there's more and more commentaries now in the American media, which is apparently speaking about the difficulties for Ukraine operating F-16s. I discussed one of these articles, the one by Beebe and Webb in Time magazine. I discussed that in my program yesterday. But there have been others as well. It's been suggested that it would take years for Ukraine to improve its infrastructure to the level, the runways and such things, to the level where they could successfully operate F-16s, and that claims that Ukrainian pilots can convert and learn to use F-16s in 4 months, that simply isn't realistic anymore. And I get the sense that there's a big pushback underway within the Pentagon against this decision to supply F-16s. I suspect that Lockheed, which I believe is the manufacturer, isn't keen on that idea either. They don't want to see their F-16s shot out of the sky. And I'm starting to think that the mood has now shifted strongly against this delivery and that it may never happen at all. Now, that is interesting. It looks also that the United States has also come to a final decision against supplying ATACMS missiles. Well, we will see. I suspect it all ultimately depends on the outcome of the offensive. If the offensive is successful, which looks increasingly unlikely, then perhaps the United States will go back on these latest decisions and supply the F-16s and the ATACMS after all. If it ends in failure, then most probably it will not. Anyway, the word is that the hunt is out again, trying to find bits and pieces of Sukhoi Su-27s and MiG-29s in Eastern Europe and around the world to try to ship these to Ukraine. In other words, providing Ukraine with old Soviet kit rather than with F-16s. Of course, this isn't being said publicly because with Ukrainian officials having made such a big issue about the supply of the F-16s, admitting that they're not going to be provided to Ukraine would also cause Ukraine considerable political and psychological damage. Well, there we are. A quiet day overall in the fighting in Ukraine, but we see more evidence of growing Russian confidence and of growing Western uncertainty. Now, there are lots of rumours and debates about a possible second mobilization in Russia. And it is undoubtedly the case, as many people have pointed out, and Gabuyev, as I said, talks about that in the article in the Financial Times. There have been a series of legal enactments which have been made in Russia which might make a mobilization easier to undertake. I think that it is possible that we will indeed see a second mobilization before this conflict fully ends. But I do think people need to perhaps be aware of certain things. There's been lots of demands from hardline people in Russia. Strelkov, the Russian militia commander who's now under legal investigation in Russia and who's a bitter hardline critic of Putin's. He's been demanding a mobilization ever since essentially the conflict started. He wants at least 1 million men to be called up to fight this war. It's important to say that prior to the start of this conflict, this particular war, prior to February 2022, the Russian military had ceased, in practical terms, to be the mobilization military that the Soviet military used to be. Soviet military operated very large numbers of divisions. Some of these divisions, those in Eastern Europe and some in the Western Soviet Union, were fully up to strength and fully equipped, but there were very large numbers of divisions scattered across the Soviet Union, the length and breadth of the Soviet Union, which were only manned by essentially a skeleton force, a few soldiers, and various officers. And the point about those divisions was that they provided a structure. So in the event that the Soviet Union found itself in a war, hundreds of thousands of men could be called up and they could be fed into these mobilization divisions, and there'd already be a structure and there'd be weapons kept in store within these divisions. There'd be a structure, weapons kept in store, there'd be officers, there'd be commanders ready to take charge of these men so that the division could be formed up quickly in a few weeks and then sent into battle. And Soviet reservists during the Cold War era had to undertake regular refresher courses to keep them up to speed with, keep them refreshed, if you like, in the kind of things they had learnt as part of their training in the Soviet military. This was the system with which which enabled the Soviet Union to prevail in the Second World War. It was the reason why the Soviets were able to produce so many divisions so fast during the Second World War, to the dismay of the Germans, and it was the system that the Soviets retained right up until the end of the Cold War. And there was a whole structure across the Soviet Union geared to assisting in this kind of mobilization. I said that troops would be called up for refresher courses, so there'd be training places where that could happen. And people often ask what the purpose of the Soviet Union keeping all these enormous stocks of old tanks and artillery pieces and things like that was. Well, one of the reasons was to ensure that these mobilization divisions would be equipped with weapons. And of course, one of the reasons these were older weapons was because they were the weapons that the troops the reservists who were being called up, some of whom would have been in their late 20s, 30s, even 40s, they would have been the weapons that they trained in when they were themselves in the army. So, and undertaking their 2-year conscription. Well, that was the structure that the Soviet Union had. But the Russian army, the modern Russian army, isn't like that. The Russian army doesn't have this structure of mobilization divisions anymore. It didn't before the big mobilization of last autumn have all of the structures needed to carry out a mass mobilization. When Putin ordered that mobilization of 300,000 men in the autumn, the general staff had to work it all out on the fly. They had to relearn all the old lessons that the Soviet Union had perfected, all those techniques the Soviet Union had perfected. It had to relearn and reestablish all of those systems all over again. And I remember that the chief of the general staff, General Gerasimov, gave an interesting interview in which he explained how challenging that was. And unsurprisingly, there were a lot of teething problems, but it speaks a great deal about Gerasimov's and the Defense Minister Shoigu's administrative abilities that all of this was overcome. But of course, bringing these troops back into the military would have taken time. Many of these troops were former contract soldiers who'd left the military only fairly recently, so they could be inducted back into their units fairly rapidly. But a lot of the others had to receive training to bring them back up to speed, where they could train, where they could be ready to act as soldiers all over again. Because the kind of refresher courses that used to exist don't exist to anything like the same extent anymore. So at the time of the mobilization, I read certain reports which said that 300,000 men was probably the absolute maximum that the Russian military could absorb at that time. So that was the reason why that number of men were called up at that time. Now, the Russian military has expanded a great deal since then, and mobilization structures have no doubt been created, and lots of lessons have been learned, and there will no doubt be scope to engage in another mobilization if Putin orders it. But that doesn't mean that all of the constraints have gone away, and of course the Russians also need to consider what the impact of mobilization, of calling up hundreds of thousands of men, might be on the civilian economy. Now, the economy is growing quite rapidly. The central bank is worried that there's possibilities, risks of overheating, which is why they've increased interest rates. One of the supply constraints is that there's actually now a shortage of workers, especially specialized workers. Taking out men in a hurry, in a rush, from the factories, from the workplaces, could make that worse. Now, it probably can be done, but it would require a fair amount of work and careful thinking and discussion as to how these people could be replaced and where replacements can be found before it is done. And of course, there's always the other way. You can call up troops, men. You can go and look for volunteers from outside Russia, especially in former Soviet Central Asia, for example, where there's plenty of young men who probably welcome the possibility of joining the Russian military, which is what used to happen during the Soviet era. A lot of the troops that would be could be mobilized came from Central Asia. There might be political difficulties in doing that today, given that all the states in Central Asia are now independent. It would have to be agreed with the local governments there, though Russian law does make that possible. And, of course, there's also issues of training, in the sense that these recruits from Central Asia might not be trained to the level that the Russian army needs. Perhaps a more sensible option would be, given that real incomes are rising in Russia, for Russian factories and plants to start importing labor from Central Asia, as they were increasingly doing until a few years ago. But that also, of course, in itself leads to political problems. At the very least, workers who are called out from the offices and the factories and are going to be replaced by immigrant workers, or, if you like, guest workers from Central Asia, will probably want some assurances that they will have a job, that they're back when they return. And of course, as in every country, floods of immigrants from outside can cause political issues. So I don't think this is quite as straightforward a thing to do as some people perhaps think. And Simplicius the thinker, in his long piece, also discusses the fact that it's all very well calling up hundreds of thousands of men, but you need to arm them as well. And maybe Russian factories are now operating at the levels and speeds that makes that possible. And maybe Shoigu's trip to North Korea will result in artillery shells coming from North Korean factories, which will supplement those from Russia. But again, we don't know the extent to which the Russians would be able to equip in a hurry large additional armies. My own general sense is that probably the Russians will undertake at some point a further mobilization. I'm going to guess, however, that will be done next year rather than over the course of this year. I think the Russians feel that they have enough men at the moment to deal with Ukraine's offensive. They also have large numbers of volunteers coming forward and joining the army. We're told that this is running at around 1,400 men a day, which would mean 40,000 a month, which would produce a force over a 10-month period of 400,000 men, which, if correct, perhaps means that a mobilization isn't necessary anyway. But putting that aside, and maybe volunteering for the Russian army will start to ease off at some point, which might make a mobilization necessary. I don't think that the Russians are looking at the moment to increase the size of their forces in Ukraine. I think, going back to what General Medvedev was saying, and remember he's the commander of that part of the Russian military, which is currently on the offensive in the Oskol, Kupiansk area. He said that the priority is to see this Ukrainian offensive off. It will probably have run its course by around the end of August. Then there will be a pause. Then the Russians will take the initiative and the war will end in spring. Spring, by the way, is around the time when Russia also holds presidential elections, though hardly anyone doubts that President Putin is going to be overwhelmingly re-elected over the course of those elections. And I should say, by the way, that I have no doubt that if there is a mobilization, that won't affect the prospects for his re-election. But anyway, we could perhaps see a second mobilization in 2024, maybe after the election, maybe just before, once the offensive is underway, the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive is out of the way, when the Russians have surveyed the landscape, got a sense of what the West is planning, and decide what they're going to do next. In the meantime, the fact that all the legal mechanisms are being put in place strongly suggests that all the administrative mechanisms are being put in place as well, and it is likely that that mobilization, when it comes, will be smoother and will function more rapidly than the one that took place last autumn. Well, that's me for today. That's all I'm going to say today in this program. I'm just going to remind you again that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can go to our shop, buy the various things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this program, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.